The 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in France. Paris at night. Gare du Nord, neon lights reflecting on wet pavement. You are standing in the city of light. The Eiffel Tower glitters 2 kilometers away. The champagne is cold, the baguettes are warm, and somewhere behind you, just one wrong turn from the tourist map, a neighborhood where the local police arrive in groups and never alone, where entire blocks operate under rules that have nothing to do with the French Republic, and where a stranger with a camera is noticed within 30 seconds of arriving. France is one of the most visited countries on Earth, nearly 100 million tourists a year. But almost none of them ever see this side of it, the side that French politicians debate in Parliament, the side that French journalists investigate, carefully, with protection, the side that the travel agencies never put in the brochure. Welcome to the channel. I am Liam. Today we are counting down the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in France, places where tourists, and sometimes even locals, simply do not go. This is not a scare story. This is real geography, real statistics, and real history. And by the end of this video, you will understand France in a way that most visitors never do. If you are new here, subscribe right now. This kind of content comes out every week. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever accidentally wandered into a neighborhood that felt seriously wrong? I want to hear your story. Now. Number 10. Marseille, Northern Districts, daytime, high-rise housing estates. Number 10. The Northern Districts of Marseille, where the city ends and something else begins. Marseille is France's second-largest city, its oldest city, and, by most serious crime measurements, its most dangerous. According to Numbeo, Marseille currently ranks as the second most dangerous city in Western Europe, with a crime index of 65.6. For context, that puts it ahead of Naples, Athens, and Brussels. The specific geography of danger in Marseille is important. The city center, the old port, the famous corniche along the seafront, these are genuinely beautiful and largely safe for visitors. The problem is the northern districts, the 13th, 14th, and 15th arrondissement. The housing estates known locally as the cités, massive concrete tower blocks built in the 1960s and 70s to house immigrant workers from North Africa, which, over the following decades, became isolated, underfunded, and gradually disconnected from the economic life of the rest of the city. These neighborhoods have been the scene of gang violence connected to drug trafficking that has made international news repeatedly. The French government's own statistics show that Marseille's homicide rate runs at approximately 2.7 per 100,000 inhabitants, roughly double the national average. In some specific housing estates within the northern districts, police operations are conducted with levels of preparation normally associated with military environments. In 2023, the violence in Marseille's northern districts became so severe that the French Parliament seriously debated deploying military units to assist law enforcement, a conversation that would have been almost unthinkable in a Western European city 2 decades earlier. By 2024, intensified police operations had reduced drug-related fatalities significantly, but the underlying structural issues remain. The rule that locals give visitors is simple. North of the Boulevard National after dark, you are in territory that has its own logic. That logic has nothing to do with tourism. Paris suburbs, Saint-Denis, low-rise housing estates, graffiti-covered walls. Number 9. Saint-Denis, the shadow of the stadium. Saint-Denis sits directly north of Paris, separated from the capital by a border that on a map looks administrative, and in practice functions like a wall between 2 different worlds. The Stade de France, where France plays its home football matches, where major concerts happen, where millions of visitors arrive for events, stands in Saint-Denis. Most of those visitors take the metro directly to the stadium and directly back. Almost none of them walk through the neighborhoods around it. Saint-Denis is considered the most problematic commune in the entire Île-de-France region. It has one of the highest poverty rates in metropolitan France, with a significant portion of the population living below the official poverty threshold. It also has one of the highest rates of petty crime, street-level drug activity, and social tension in the country. What strikes people who visit Saint-Denis for the first time is the completeness of the demographic transformation from central Paris. In certain streets, French as a primary language and French as a cultural reference point have receded almost entirely. The commerce, the signage, the social dynamics, all of it operates on different terms. This is not inherently dangerous in itself, but the combination of extreme poverty, minimal economic opportunity, high population density, and decades of institutional neglect has created an environment where the social contract that functions in most of France functions here only partially. French sociologist Hugues Lagrange, who spent years studying these communities, described Saint-Denis and comparable communes as places where state authority has become negotiated rather than assumed. The police are present, but their presence is contested in ways that have no equivalent in most European cities. For a visitor, the practical advice is consistent across every source. Saint-Denis is not a place to explore without local knowledge, without someone who knows the specific streets, and certainly not after dark. Paris, 18th arrondissement, Barbès-Rochechouart metro station, street level, number 8. Barbès and the 18th arrondissement, the other Montmartre. The 18th arrondissement of Paris contains one of the most famous tourist destinations in the world, Montmartre, the hill with the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, the artist studios, the vineyards, the postcard views of the city. It also contains Barbès-Rochechouart, which is one of the most frequently cited dangerous areas in Paris, and which sits approximately 15 minutes walk from those postcard views. The disconnect is jarring. You walk from the beautifully restored squares of Upper Montmartre through a few blocks and arrive in a neighborhood where the sidewalks around the metro entrance function as an informal open-air market for goods of uncertain provenance, where confrontations between groups happen regularly enough that they no longer surprise anyone, and where the atmosphere shifts from tourist Paris to something significantly more tense within the distance of a few hundred meters. The Barbès quarter specifically, and the surrounding streets of the lower 18th arrondissement, have been described in French media as among the most challenging urban environments in the capital. The concentration of extreme poverty, the informal economy that operates on the streets, the high density of people with nowhere stable to go, all of it creates friction that occasionally becomes something worse. A journalist for Le Monde described walking through Barbès as entering a city that Paris contains but does not control. That phrase has been repeated many times since because it captures something real about the experience. The advice given consistently by Parisian guides and local authorities: Montmartre by day is wonderful and safe. Barbès by night is a different calculation entirely. Paris, Gare du Nord, 10th arrondissement, morning rush hour. Number 7. Gare du Nord and the 10th arrondissement, Europe's busiest station, has a problem. Gare du Nord is the busiest railway station in Europe. More than 200 million passengers pass through it every year. Eurostar trains from London, TGV trains from across France, RER lines connecting the suburbs to the capital. It is the first thing millions of visitors to France see when they arrive, and it has a persistent, well-documented reputation as one of the most uncomfortable public spaces in Western Europe. The area immediately surrounding Gare du Nord, the streets of the 10th arrondissement within a few blocks of the station, has been flagged repeatedly in police reports, tourist advisories, and French parliamentary discussions as an area requiring particular vigilance. Pickpocketing operations in and around the station are organized and professional. The surrounding streets have concentrations of people in difficult circumstances, drug dependency, homelessness, statelessness, that create an atmosphere of tension and unpredictability. What makes Gare du Nord particularly complicated is that you cannot easily avoid it. If you arrive in Paris by train from London or from northern France, you are in it. The advice from every serious travel resource is the same. Move through purposefully, do not stop unnecessarily, keep your bags in front of you, and leave the station on the side facing the Boulevard de Denain rather than the smaller side streets. The station itself has increased security presence significantly in recent years, including additional police patrols and camera coverage. But the structural conditions that make the surrounding area challenging, extreme urban poverty concentrated in one location, a very high density of vulnerable people, the anonymity that comes with a massive transit hub, are not solved by cameras. Gare du Nord is a place to pass through, not to linger around, and certainly not to explore the surrounding streets at night. Paris suburbs, Clichy-sous-Bois, housing estates towers at dusk, number 6. Clichy-sous-Bois, the neighborhood that sparked a nation. In October 2005, 2 teenagers died in Clichy-sous-Bois, a commune in the northeastern suburbs of Paris. What followed was 3 weeks of civil unrest that spread from Clichy-sous-Bois to more than 300 French cities and towns, resulting in nearly 10,000 vehicles being set alight, nearly 3,000 arrests, and a national state of emergency, the first since the Algerian War. The entire world watched. The reasons behind those events have been analyzed exhaustively by French sociologists, politicians, and journalists in the 2 decades since. The consensus is that Clichy-sous-Bois represented an extreme version of a problem that existed across dozens of French suburbs. Communities built to house immigrant workers and their families that had been systematically underfunded, underserved by public transport, isolated from employment centers, and largely abandoned by the institutions of the French Republic. Today, Clichy-sous-Bois remains one of the most deprived communes in metropolitan France. Its poverty rate, its unemployment rate, its dropout rate, all sit at or near the top of the national statistics for the wrong reasons. The physical environment has improved somewhat, with some demolition of the worst housing blocks and reconstruction. But the underlying social and economic conditions that made 2005 possible have not been resolved. For visitors, Clichy-sous-Bois is not a tourist destination in any sense. There is nothing in it designed for visitors. It is a residential suburban commune where people live difficult lives, and where the presence of outsiders without a clear reason for being there is noticed and rarely welcomed. The journey from Paris requires a specific bus route because, famously, there is still no direct rail connection to the commune, a geographic isolation that became a symbol of its political abandonment. The French government's official classification of zones needing priority intervention, the so-called QPV, Quartiers Prioritaires de la Politique de la Ville, includes Clichy-sous-Bois in full. There are approximately 1,300 such priority zones across France. Clichy-sous-Bois is in the most severe category. Have you ever visited a place in Europe that surprised you with how different it felt from everything around it? Write it in the comments right now. I read every single one, and I want to know what you experienced. Lyon. La Duchère district, panoramic view from the hillside number 5. La Duchère, Lyon. The Forgotten Hill. Lyon is France's third city, a food capital, a UNESCO heritage site, a city of Renaissance architecture and world-class restaurants. It is also home to La Duchère, a hilltop district in the city's 9th arrondissement that spent several decades as one of the most troubled neighborhoods in the country. La Duchère was built in the 1960s as a grand modernist project, thousands of apartments in high-rise towers on a hill overlooking the city, designed to house working-class families in modern conditions. The plan was ambitious. The execution created, over the following decades, one of the most isolated and impoverished urban environments in France, with youth unemployment running at several times the city average, and social tensions that periodically resulted in serious unrest. The area became particularly associated with drug trafficking networks that operated from the tower blocks, and that brought with them the kind of low-level violence and intimidation that made large parts of the district genuinely uncomfortable to move through. Police operations in La Duchère in the 2000s and 2010s regularly resulted in significant seizures and arrests, but the underlying economics of the drug trade made it extraordinarily difficult to eliminate. A major regeneration project has been underway in La Duchère for over a decade, involving the demolition of several of the largest tower blocks, the construction of mixed-use housing, and the creation of new public spaces. The results are visible and real. Parts of the district that were no-go zones 20 years ago are now functional urban spaces. But the transformation is incomplete, and the areas that have not yet been reached by the regeneration remain challenging. La Duchère is an important example of a broader French pattern. Massive mid-20th century housing estates built with genuine social ambition that were never given the sustained investment needed to remain functional as communities. France has hundreds of versions of this story. Lyon's version happens to be among the better-known ones. Grenoble, southeastern suburbs, Villeneuve district, concrete towers, number 4. Villeneuve, Grenoble, the village that became a warning. Grenoble is a university city in the French Alps. It hosted the Winter Olympics in 1968. It is surrounded by mountains and is, in its center, a prosperous and pleasant place to live. It is also home to the Villeneuve district, a neighborhood that became so associated with gang activity and serious crime that it generated a specific political crisis at the national level. The Villeneuve district was built in the 1970s as an idealistic social housing project, La Villeneuve de Grenoble, designed by architects who believed in the social value of integrated community spaces, shared amenities, and modernist planning. It was meant to be a model. Within 2 decades, it had become one of the most troubled neighborhoods in France. In 2010, President Nicolas Sarkozy visited Grenoble following a series of serious incidents in the area and delivered a speech that effectively declared parts of Villeneuve to be outside the normal functioning of the French Republic. The speech was politically controversial, but the underlying description of the conditions in the neighborhood was not seriously disputed. The specific problems in Villeneuve are those common to the worst French problem neighborhoods: organized drug networks using the architecture of the housing estate, with its enclosed courtyards and multiple exit routes, as operational infrastructure. The towers provide lookouts. The enclosed spaces provide transaction points. The social pressure of a community in which a significant proportion of young men are involved in the same networks makes cooperation with police authorities genuinely risky for residents. Independent journalists and researchers who have spent time in Villeneuve describe an experience of entering a space that operates according to a parallel authority structure. Rules exist. They are enforced. They are simply not the rules of the French state. Grenoble's municipal authorities have invested significantly in Villeneuve over the past decade, with mixed results. Demolitions, reconstruction, social programs, increased police presence. The situation is better than it was at its worst. It is not resolved. Paris. Stalingrad metro station area, 19th arrondissement, night. Number 3. The Stalingrad zone, Paris. A city within a city. The area around the Stalingrad metro station in the 19th arrondissement of Paris has become, over the past decade, one of the most extreme examples of urban dysfunction in a major European capital. The name comes from the metro station, named in honor of the Second World War battle. The current reality of the neighborhood has nothing to do with history. The Stalingrad area became the location of the largest migrant encampment ever seen in Paris, at its peak housing several thousand people in conditions that French government reports described as extraordinarily difficult. Multiple clearance operations were conducted, each temporarily dispersing the encampment, each followed by its reformation within weeks. Between 2016 and 2022, the French Interior Ministry conducted more than 60 clearance operations in the area around Stalingrad and the nearby Canal Saint-Martin. The encampments reformed each time. The area around the station during this period was described by French journalists and local residents as operating in a kind of humanitarian emergency state. Very large numbers of extremely vulnerable people in a relatively small geographic area, with no legal status, no access to formal services, and no prospect of rapid resolution. This combination produced an environment that was genuinely dangerous, though the danger was as much about the desperation of people in impossible circumstances as about organized criminality. The situation has been partially managed since then through a combination of formal asylum processing acceleration, the opening of dedicated reception centers outside Paris, and persistent clearance operations. The area today is significantly less extreme than it was at the worst points of the crisis, but the Stalingrad zone remains one of the most socially complex areas in the capital, and the underlying pressures that produced the crisis, the flow of migrants through France, the inadequacy of the asylum system, the lack of affordable housing, remain entirely unresolved. Local residents of the 19th arrondissement describe living through a decade of extraordinary stress in their neighborhood, watching their public spaces occupied by an encampment that the authorities could not clear permanently, experiencing petty crime at levels well above the city average, and feeling that their district had been essentially abandoned by the institutions of the city and the state. What would you do if the neighborhood you lived in changed this dramatically around you? Would you stay? Or would you leave? Write it in the comments. Seriously, I want to know what you think. Marseille, les Quartiers Nord, housing estate, high concrete towers, afternoon number 2. Les Quartiers Nord, Marseille, the capital of French criminality. We return to Marseille for the second entry in our list because the northern districts of this city are not one story, they are many, and the most intense of them deserves its own place near the top. The Quartiers Nord is a collective name for the housing estates of Marseille's northern arrondissement, primarily the 13th, 14th, and 15th. These neighborhoods contain some of the largest and most isolated social housing estates in France. La Castellane, La Bousserine, Les Lauriers, La Bricard. Names that appear regularly in French crime statistics and in the reports of French law enforcement agencies. The specific characteristic of the Quartiers Nord that distinguishes it from even the most troubled Parisian suburbs is the degree to which the drug economy has become the primary organizing economic structure of entire neighborhoods. The French government's own analysis has described certain streets within these estates as territories where the formal economy effectively does not function, and where the drug trade is not a parallel economy, but the dominant one. The homicide figures from Marseille in recent years have generated national outrage and sustained political attention. Shootings connected to rivalry between drug distribution networks have claimed the lives not only of those involved in the trade, but of bystanders, including, in several high-profile incidents that produced significant public anger, children who happened to be in the wrong place. The French police use the term règlement de compte, settling of accounts, as a category of violent incident, and in Marseille, this category has been running at levels that are extraordinary by any Western European standard. The French state's response has been significant. The Marseille en Grand plan, announced by President Macron, committed billions of euros in investment in infrastructure, schools, transport, and social services in Marseille's most deprived areas. Drug-related homicides fell significantly in 2024 compared to 2023, which French authorities attributed to both increased police operations and the beginning of investment effects. These are genuine improvements, but the scale of the structural problems, decades of poverty, isolation, and institutional neglect, means that even significant investment will take years to produce visible change at the neighborhood level. For visitors, the Quartiers Nord are not a place to visit. Not because the people who live there are inherently hostile to outsiders. Most of them are simply people trying to live their lives under very difficult conditions. But because the violence that occurs in these neighborhoods, though largely directed within specific groups, is unpredictable enough that presence in certain streets at certain times carries real risk that no tourist should take on. Paris suburbs, Sevran, night, empty streets, shuttered shops. Number 1. Sevran. The suburb that France forgot. Sevran. A commune of approximately 50,000 people in the Seine-Saint-Denis department, northeast of Paris. Accessible by RER train in about 30 minutes from the Gare du Nord. On a map, it looks like an ordinary Parisian suburb. In the lived experience of its residents, and in the statistics of French law enforcement, it is France's most consistently troubled urban area, and the location most frequently cited when French politicians and researchers discuss the failure of the Republican model to reach all French citizens equally. Seine-Saint-Denis as a department is the poorest in metropolitan France. Within Seine-Saint-Denis, Sevran occupies a particular position. Its poverty rate, its unemployment rate, its school dropout rate, its crime rate, all are at or near the extreme end of the national distribution. The city has been repeatedly designated as a priority intervention zone by successive French governments, and successive French governments have found that intervention, however well-funded and well-intentioned, produces changes that are slower and more partial than the political promises attached to them. The specific neighborhoods within Sevran that are considered most problematic, the Beaudot estate, the Rougemont quarter, are places where the urban environment itself communicates a kind of institutional abandonment. Buildings in states of disrepair that would not be permitted elsewhere in France, public spaces that receive maintenance at levels far below what is considered standard in other French communes. A physical environment that tells the people living in it, clearly and continuously, that the resources of the state are not equally distributed. But the physical environment is the least of it. The social environment, the concentration of poverty, the near total absence of private sector employment, the dominance of the informal economy, the presence of gang structures that provide both income and a form of social order in the absence of functioning institutions, is what makes Sevran genuinely dangerous rather than merely deprived. French journalist Faiza Zerouala, who grew up in Seine-Saint-Denis and has written extensively about the area, described Sevran as the place where France's broken promises are most visible. She was not being metaphorical. The promises of the French Republic, liberty, equality, fraternity, the secular state, the meritocratic school, all exist in Sevran in formal terms. The schools are there, the libraries are there, the tricolor flies from the town hall. But the conditions that would make those promises real, adequate housing, employment, a functional environment, equal treatment by institutions, are present in Sevran at a fraction of the level they are present in more favored parts of France. Research by the Institut Montaigne and other French think tanks has shown that a child born in Seine-Saint-Denis has a statistical life trajectory that is radically different from a child born in the western suburbs of Paris, despite both being born in the same metropolitan area, the same country, under the same laws and the same constitutional guarantees. The gap in educational attainment, in income, in health outcomes, in contact with the criminal justice system, all of these are so large that they function, in practice, as a form of geographic destiny. Sevran tops our list not because it is the most violently dramatic neighborhood in France. Marseille's Quartiers Nord probably holds that distinction. It tops the list because it represents the most complete version of a failure that runs through all 10 entries on this list. A failure of the state to make its own promises real. A failure of the wealthiest country in Western Europe to ensure that all its citizens live in conditions worthy of their citizenship. Paris. View from the Eiffel Tower at dusk, the city stretching in all directions. We have been through 10 neighborhoods in 10 different cities, from the housing towers of Marseille's north to the forgotten suburb of Sevran, from the area around Gare du Nord to the hillsides of Lyon, from the suburbs where the riots of 2005 began to the streets where the French state has been conducting clearance operations for a decade. What connects all of them is not the presence of dangerous people. The people who live in these neighborhoods are, overwhelmingly, ordinary people. Families, workers, students, elderly residents, trying to build their lives in environments that make that harder than it should be. The danger in these places is not primarily a product of who lives there. It is a product of what has been done to these places, or more precisely, what has not been done. Decades of insufficient investment, poor transport connections that cut neighborhoods off from employment, school systems under-resourced relative to need, housing stock allowed to deteriorate below any reasonable standard, drug economies that filled the vacuum left by the formal economy, and institutions, police, social services, local government, stretched so thin in these areas that their authority became negotiated rather than established. France calls itself the country of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And France, in many ways, is that country. But these 10 neighborhoods are the places where that self-description runs into the hardest test, where the equality guaranteed by the Constitution is most visibly absent in practice, where liberty is constrained not by law but by circumstance, where fraternity, the idea that we are all part of the same community with obligations to each other, has been in practice most comprehensively ignored. French politicians across the political spectrum have acknowledged this. They have produced reports, announced plans, allocated budgets. Some of those budgets have produced real improvements in real places. La Duchère in Lyon is genuinely better than it was 15 years ago. Parts of Marseille's northern districts are being physically transformed. Some of Sevran's worst housing has been demolished and replaced. But the structural scale of the problem, the accumulated deficit of decades of inadequate attention to the parts of France that were built to house workers and then forgotten when those workers were no longer needed, is not solved by any single plan or any single government. This is not a uniquely French problem. Every wealthy country has its version of this geography. The places where the economy's growth never arrived, or arrived and then departed. The places where housing was built cheap and fast and never maintained. The places where the children grow up knowing that the rules are different for them than they are for children in other parts of the same city. France's version is just unusually visible, unusually concentrated, and unusually well documented, because France has a tradition of serious social research, serious journalism, and serious political argument about exactly these questions. Before I wrap up, I want to ask you something important. Of everything in this video, the geography, the history, the statistics, the stories, what surprised you the most? What did you not know before today? And if you have been to France, did you see any of this? Did you wander somewhere that felt wrong and not know what you were looking at? Write it in the comments. This channel is not just me talking at you. It is a conversation, and your perspective genuinely changes how I think about these topics. Every comment gets read. If this video gave you something to think about, share it with someone who thinks they know France. Chances are, they only know half of it. I am Liam. New videos every week. See you in the next one.